I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode, The Silent Return. William sat across from his mother, Claire, in the dimly lit sitting room, the air thick with unspoken words. He fidgeted nervously, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Mum, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire looked up from her needlework, her brow furrowing with concern. "What is it, William? You're making me nervous." Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself. "I've joined the army, Mum. I've enlisted. I'm going to fight in the war." The color drained from Claire's face, and her needlework slipped from her fingers. "What? No, William, you can't. You're only 16. You're too young to go to war." Ashamed, William looked down at his hands. He had known this would be hard, but he hadn't expected her to be so devastated. "I had to do it, Mum," he said, his voice trembling. "I couldn't just stand by while other men went to fight. I want to do my part." Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Well, what about your future, your education, your life?" William's heart ached at her words. "I know it's not ideal, Mum, but I have to do this. I have to fight for our country, for our freedom. It's the right thing to do." She buried her face in her hands, and William felt a lump form in his throat. He wished he could take back his decision, but he knew he couldn't. He had made a commitment and he had to see it through. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I know it's hard, but I'll come back, I promise." Claire looked up, her face streaked with tears. "You don't know that, William. You could be killed. You could be maimed. You could never come back at all." A cold shiver ran down his spine. He hadn't wanted to think about dying, about never seeing his family again. But now, faced with her pain and fear, he couldn't ignore it. Claire searched his face for a long moment, then nodded, resigned. "All right, William, if you must go, then go. But promise me one thing." "What's that, Mum?" he asked, his heart racing. "Promise me that you'll come back," she said, her voice trembling. "No matter what happens, you'll come back to me. Promise me that, William." Tears streamed down his face as he nodded. "I promise, Mum. I'll come back. I'll make it home to you, no matter what." 3 days later, William was dispatched for training before being sent to the front lines of the Great War. Claire received letters from him occasionally, each one a lifeline that she clung to desperately. He wrote about life in the trenches, the relentless mud, the pervasive fear, and the constant cacophony of artillery fire. He described the friendships he formed, particularly with two older soldiers named James and Anders, who had taken him under their wing, offering guidance and support amongst the chaos. Claire sat in her small sitting room, the afternoon sun filtering through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn wooden floor. In her hands, she held William's letters, their edges frayed from countless readings. Each letter transported her to a world far removed from her own, where she could almost hear William's voice recounting his experiences, filled with youthful bravado and vulnerability. As she unfolded the latest letter, the familiar scent of ink and paper enveloped her. She imagined him, his bright eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead, and the infectious smile that had once lit up her days. With each line, she felt as if she were there with him, sharing in his fears and triumphs, even if only in her mind. The weight of her sorrow was often unbearable. The house felt empty without William's laughter, and the silence echoed with memories of their time together. She would sit in his room, surrounded by his belongings, the model airplane he had been building, the books he had left half-read, and the photographs of happier times. Each item was a painful reminder of the boy who had once filled her life with joy, now replaced by an aching void. In her reveries, Claire often drifted back to memories of her late husband, Randolph. She recalled the time they had taken William to the theater for his first show. The three of them had sat in the dimly lit auditorium, the air thick with anticipation. Randolph had leaned down to whisper jokes to William, making him giggle uncontrollably, while Claire watched them with a heart full of love. The joy on William's face as a curtain rose was a moment she would never forget, a snapshot of their little family before Randolph's untimely death in a mine accident and before the shadows of war crept in. In the letters, she found a flicker of hope. William wrote about the camaraderie that blossomed amidst the chaos of war. He spoke of James and Anders, and Claire felt a sense of relief knowing he was not alone. She imagined the three of them huddled together in the trenches, sharing stories and laughter to ward off the darkness that threatened to consume them. As she read about their nightly sentry duties, Claire's heart raced. She could almost feel the tension in the air, the weight of responsibility resting on William's young shoulders. Each letter was a reminder of the sacrifices he was making, and she felt a swell of pride mixed with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. In the quiet moments after reading, Claire often found herself lost in thought, staring out the window at the world beyond. The vibrant colors of the garden, once a source of joy, now seemed muted and distant. She longed for the days when she, Randolph, and William would pick flowers together, their laughter mingling with the gentle breeze. Those memories felt like a distant dream, overshadowed by the weight of her current reality. With each passing day, Claire learned to navigate her grief, finding solace in her son's words. The letters became a ritual, a way to honor his memory and keep his spirit alive. She would sit by the fireplace, a cup of tea in hand, and read aloud to the empty room, as if sharing the stories with William himself. In those moments, she felt a flicker of connection, a reminder that even in the depths of her sorrow, love could bridge the distance between them. One day, a telegram arrived at Claire's house. She opened it with trembling fingers, knowing what it might say. Her worst fears were realized when she read the short message. William is missing in action, presumed dead. Her heart shattered into a million pieces. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her son, her beautiful, brave son, was gone. She would never see him again. In the weeks that followed, Claire found herself enveloped in a fog of grief. The vibrant colors of her life dulled into shades of gray, and the laughter that once filled her home was replaced by an oppressive silence. She retreated into herself, spending hours in William's room, surrounded by his belongings, the model airplane, the half-read books, the photographs. Each item was a painful reminder of the boy who had once filled her life with joy, now replaced by an aching void. Despite her desire to isolate herself, the world outside her door refused to let her fade away. Neighbors, well-meaning but unaware of the depths of her sorrow, would drop by with casseroles and flowers, their voices filled with sympathy. "We're here for you, Claire," they would say, their eyes filled with concern. "You don't have to go through this alone." At first, Claire would nod politely, offering a weak smile as she accepted their gestures of kindness. But inside, she felt a growing resentment. How could they possibly understand the depth of her pain? How could they expect her to move on when her son was gone? She would retreat to her sitting room, the faint light filtering through the lace curtains, and allow the tears to flow freely, mourning the loss of her boy in solitude. As the months passed, the visits became less frequent, but the occasional gentleman caller would still appear at her doorstep, hoping to offer companionship. Claire would sit stiffly in her parlor, engaging in polite conversation, but her heart was not in it. The thought of love felt foreign and unattainable. How could she open her heart to another man when it still ached for William and her husband? Each suitor left her feeling more hollow than before, their well-meaning advances only serving to remind her of the loves she had lost. Then, one day, a new face appeared in her life. His name was Thomas, a widower whose son was serving in France. He had moved into the neighborhood seeking a fresh start, and their paths crossed at a local gathering. Thomas was kind and gentle, with a warmth that drew Claire in. They began to share their stories, their mutual loss, creating an unspoken bond between them. As they spent time together, Claire found herself laughing again, albeit reluctantly. Thomas spoke of his son, a bright young man who had enlisted with dreams of adventure. Claire listened, her heart heavy with the bittersweet knowledge that while Thomas's son was serving, hers was lost forever. Yet, in Thomas, she found a kindred spirit, someone who understood the weight of grief and the longing for connection. When Thomas's son, Samuel, returned home from the war, Claire's heart twisted with conflicting emotions. The joy of his return was palpable, and the neighborhood celebrated with a small gathering in his honor. Claire stood on the fringes, watching as families reunited, tears of joy mingling with her own sorrow. Samuel was everything William could have been, young, vibrant, and full of life. In that moment, Claire felt a pang of bitterness. How could she celebrate when her own son would never return? The joy of others felt like a cruel reminder of her loss. She found herself withdrawing again, torn between the happiness she wanted to feel for Thomas and Samuel and the grief that threatened to consume her. But Thomas, perceptive and patient, reached out to her. "Claire, I know this is hard for you," he said one evening as they sat on her porch, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink. "But Samuel is not a replacement for William. I would never ask you to forget your son, and neither would Samuel. What I ask is that you accept Samuel as you would William. Please." That evening, the three of them came together to erect a small memorial for William next to the family hearth, a symbol of love that they all hoped would bridge the past and the present. Thomas's actions and words had struck a chord within her. Slowly, Claire began to open her heart again, allowing herself to feel joy in Samuel's presence. She watched him readjust to the civilian life, find a job, and eventually a girl. As the seasons changed, so did Claire's heart. The warmth of Thomas's companionship began to fill the void left by William's absence. She found herself laughing more, her spirit lifting as she embraced the love that blossomed between them. Eventually, Thomas proposed, and Claire accepted, knowing that this new chapter in her life would not erase her past, but rather honor it. They married in a small ceremony surrounded by friends and family, with Samuel standing proudly by their side. In the years that followed, Claire embraced her role as a stepmother, finding joy in the little moments they shared as a family. She would often take Samuel to the garden, where they would plant flowers in memory of William, teaching him about the boy who had once filled her life with laughter. Though the ache of loss would never fully fade, Claire learned to carry it with her, allowing it to coexist with the love she had found again. In her heart, she held both William and Samuel, honoring the memory of her son while embracing the new life she had built with Thomas. Through love and resilience, Claire transformed her grief into a legacy of hope, proving that even in the depths of sorrow, life could still bloom anew. In the year of 1939, Thomas stood at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. He had just finished reading a letter that had arrived from Norway, a letter from a man named Anders Jensen. 3 years had passed since Claire's death, and the ache of her absence still lingered in every corner of their home. As he read Anders' words, he felt a stirring in his heart. The letter was framed as an inquiry from a friend of William's during the war, expressing concern for Claire's well-being. Anders wrote of his own life in Norway, sharing vague details about the peace he had found, but never mentioned the war directly or the circumstances that had led to William's fate. Instead, he asked about Claire, hoping to learn if she was still alive and how she had fared in the years since William had left for war. With a heavy heart, Thomas penned a response, his hand trembling as he wrote. He knew he had to tell Anders the truth, that Claire had passed away 3 years prior, her spirit forever tied to the memory of her son. He wrote of her unwavering love, how she had held on to hope until her last breath, believing that William would one day return. As he sealed the envelope, a sense of relief washed over him. Even though she had not lived to see it, there seemed to be a sense of closure to William's fate. 3 years later, an older gentleman approached the cemetery, his heart heavy with the weight of memories long buried. He asked the caretaker for direction to Claire Anderson's grave, introducing himself as Anders Jensen. The caretaker gestured toward a quiet corner of the cemetery, and as he walked, a sense of dread settled in his chest. There before him lay not one, but 3 graves: Randolph, Claire, and William. The sight of William's name jolted him, a visceral reminder of the boy he once was. It had been 35 years since he had shed that name, the name of a frightened child who had witnessed the deaths of a family in the chaos of war before fleeing the horrors that unfolded that night. In that moment, he felt the truth wash over him. William had died that day, replaced by Anders, a name he had adopted in a desperate bid to embody the bravery he had lacked. As memories flooded back, he was thrust into the chaos of that fateful night in Belgium, 1914. The deafening explosion shattered the air, ripping through the fragile veil of hope. Smoke billowed around him, obscuring the scene as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. He could see the family they had tried to rescue. They had survived no man's land only to be ended by a shell in a trench. The father lay lifeless beside his wife, while their two small girls clung to her, their innocent faces forever frozen in a moment of terror. Anders, the real Anders, lay there as well, his brave attempt to save them now a grim testament to the futility of their escape. The weight of his sacrifice hung heavy in the air, a haunting reminder of the courage that had been snuffed out in an instant. But in that moment of horror, William felt a primal fear surge through him, overwhelming his senses. Instead of standing his ground, he activated his flight response, turning away from the devastation. He ran, leaving the chaos behind. In the years that followed, after reaching the shores of Norway, he took on the name Anders, not just to survive, but to honor the bravery he had witnessed that night, a bravery he had never found within himself. Anders had risked his life running into no man's land, while William had chosen to flee. The weight of that choice had haunted him ever since, a constant reminder of the boy who had been too afraid to stand his ground. As he stood before the graves, more memories surged like a tidal wave. Echoes of laughter, the warmth of love, and the unwavering faith of a mother who had never stopped believing in him. He had carved out a new life in Norway, trying to forget the boy he once was. But now, facing the gravestones, the weight of his past bore down on him like a suffocating shroud. 3 years ago, he had dared to reach out to Claire, pouring his heart out into a letter that had never been sent. The letter he sent instead was pale by comparison. When he finally received a reply from a man named Thomas, it shattered him. Claire had died. The regret crashed over him like a relentless storm. He mourned the countless letters he had written but never sent, each one a missed opportunity to bridge the chasm of silence that had grown between them. He regretted not risking everything to return home, to see her one last time. He regretted the fateful day when he, Anders, and James had tried to save a small Belgian family only to be met with the chaos of a random German shell that had shattered their lives forever. Overwhelmed by emotion, he sank to his knees beside his mother's grave, tears streaming down his weathered face. All those years, all the pain, all the silence. How terrifying it must have been for her, waiting for a son who never returned. He could almost hear her voice, filled with love and longing, calling out to him through the years. After a moment, he rose, the rain beginning to fall gently around him, each drop a reminder of the sorrow he carried. A crushing pain surged in his chest, and his right arm began to ache. As he collapsed to the ground, a bittersweet smile crossed his lips. In that final moment, he recognized the cruel irony of his life. He had spent years running away from William, the boy he had been, and now he would take his last breath on that young boy's grave, finally returning home to the love he had lost, to the mother who had never stopped searching for him. Thank you for listening to World War I Stories, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. I'm Henny B, your host and storyteller. Please like and subscribe, and maybe even leave a review for us wherever you find your podcasts. And join us again for more World War I Stories.